ICANN works with children and young people from 0 to 25 who have speech, language and communication needs through workforce development programs, evidence interventions and influencing strategic approaches at local and national level. ICANN also runs 2 residential special schools for children and young people with developmental language disorder. Louisa is a speech and language therapist with 30 years of experience of working to support children and young people with speech, language and communication needs. And she's been involved in a number of large-scale projects developing evidence solutions for SLCM. She is also experienced in promoting and facilitating multi-agency working to support children at all ages through ICANN's place-based approach. She currently leads on the DFE-funded Home Learning Environment project, changing the conversation about language, and in her new role, will be developing ICANN's outcomes framework and evaluative approach across all its activities. Thank you so much, Louisa, for joining us today, and I'll pass over to you now.
Thank you very much, Darren, and hello to everyone. So we've got half an hour, and it's a huge topic, as I'm sure some of you might be aware. So big it even has 3 words to describe it: speech, language, and communication. And I'll be using the SLCN acronym throughout, just for the sake of time, really. So just before I make a start, just to kind of get you to reflect on the fact that all of you listening, I'm sure, have jobs which rely on you having really good communication skills. And for those of you and those of us who find communication easy, it's very effortless. But actually, if you struggle with being understood or with understanding spoken language, then it can have really profound implications. And we're going to look at some of those now. So what is the issue for children? You'll see a number of bullet points here with some statistics, but really the main thing that I would like to get across to you today is the fact that because most of the education curriculum is delivered through the spoken word, it means that children who struggle with language and communication are going to struggle to learn across age and phase. And the increasingly abstract language that they come across in secondary school means that some who cope quite well in primary will start to fail when they get into year 7. And I'm sure those of you who work in secondary can understand and see where that begins to happen. But in addition to the impact on attainment and on learning, we also need to think about the impact on friendship formation and on social skills development of having speech, language and communication difficulties. So think about some of the complex rules of games that children play from early years onwards. You know, even those boys who are running around in the playground have really quite complex rules for how you join the game and how you play. And that's not to mention the sort of jokes and the plays on words that come in as children reach the top end of primary, and all the sophisticated communication skills that are required to navigate your way through the social structure of a secondary school. So that figure in the middle, about the 50%, we know that that's quite common in areas of disadvantage. And that means for some schools, half the class lacks the vocabulary, the ability to structure sentences verbally, let alone in the written form, and don't follow instructions because they don't understand what they're being told to do. And the effect on behaviour can be quite profound. So imagine if you haven't mastered the nt of don't run in school, and then you're going to get yourself into all sorts of trouble. And children with SLCN are often labelled as naughty or challenging in their behaviour, or even as SEMH before anybody thinks to investigate their comprehension skills. And then this final statistic here about the importance of early language skills. So language development starts before birth, and babies can hear in the womb and they respond to familiar voices, in particular familiar voices from the time that they're born. So by the time they get to 2 years, and many 2-year-olds aren't in education, are they? They're at home. They haven't had a lot of encouraging and enabling language directed at them in some areas, and so they're already behind their peers. so that by the time you get them in nursery or in school, they're already playing catch up with a lot of their peer group. So this challenge of early identification of SLCN and making sure that children get the support they need, it's not just important for those individual children, but there are societal costs to us if we don't identify these children and meet their needs. And I've given you a few on the statistics here. So the first figures are very high, and there's a double whammy for children and young people with SLCN who have behaviour or mental health difficulties. And that is that the very treatments and approaches that are designed to help foster resilience and mental health, and that many of them are being adopted in schools now, and they're often referred to as talking therapies. And so using language to support children and young people. But if they have SLCN, then accessing those mental health services puts them, the challenges to access can put them at a further disadvantage. I've put in a statistic here again about the importance of early language in terms of long-term outcomes for children, but I want to pick up particularly on this last statistic. You can see how SLCN makes young people vulnerable to exploitation and to offending behaviour. And then once they're in that system, you can imagine how complex the justice system can be, and how bewildering and overwhelming it can be for young people who have SLCN. So just a few more up-to-date facts and figures here. This slide really shows that the identification of SLCN is on the increase, but still below what research tells us is the number to expect in the child population. So that's 7.6% for developmental language disorder, 10% as we looked at earlier in terms of the wider SLCN, and that's not looking at the, in some areas, 50% of children who are struggling. And at the same time, the Children's Commissioner report on access to speech and language therapy, which is entitled We Need to Talk, has identified a huge reduction in funding for services to support children. So having looked at what the issue is, let's have a very brief look at what works to tackle SLCN and in order to push back against the impact it has on attainment and emotional development and behaviour. So the first thing I'd like to pick up here is identification. And this can be a real challenge for early years and school staff who don't receive training in speech, language and communication development when they do their initial qualifications. And so they don't know what's typical at each age. If you don't know what's typical in terms of speech, language and communication, and what and when the skills develop, it's very challenging to identify what's going wrong and to pin down exactly where the difficulty lies for children and young people. And in some areas where there are large numbers of children with poor language skills, staff can find their expectations of what's typical become quite skewed. And so that children whose language skills are average at best seem to be very highly verbal because they're compared to their largely silent peer group. The workforce development is absolutely crucial here, both so that staff can know when there's a problem, but also so that they know what to do to support children's speech, language and communication across the whole class in some areas. There is some evidence that training for both teaching staff and parents can help improve outcomes for children and young people with language disorder, but this training needs to include coaching and feedback, and it needs to take place over time. We really need to think about how we're going to skill up our workforce and give them the tools they need. And part of that skilling is obviously looking at adapting teaching and learning. And when we're looking again at these classrooms where over half of children have SLCN, then we're clearly not going to be able to address that problem by getting in a speech and language therapist, no matter how able. And that numbers of this magnitude take it out of the SEND department and make this a whole school teaching and learning issue. This is particularly a challenge in secondary schools, where pupils can be quite well supported by the pastoral team, but they might struggle outside of this environment, where their particular communication needs are met across teachers within different faculties and subject areas. So one of the solutions could be targeted interventions. There are a lot of these about. Schools and early years settings need to look for evidenced interventions which are easy to implement in the context of their daily activities of the school and the setting, and where there are clear measures that you can use to track the progress that children make. And finally on here, a word about specialists. Usually in this context, we're talking about speech and language therapists. They do exist. They can be an invaluable resource to draw on. They're starting to identify and use the new developmental language disability diagnosis so that children and young people and their families can understand the condition and its implications for them. Speech and language therapists can help early years settings and schools across primary and secondary to identify the need, plan workforce development, identify targeted interventions, as well as deliver individual specialist assessment and support packages. So just a little bit about ICANN here. I think Darren's kind of covered that in his introduction. And here are some of the solutions that we can offer to schools and settings. If you'd like any more information about any of those, that's available on our website. Just wanted to share this with you. This is our summary of our reach and impact last year. As Darren mentioned, we're developing an outcomes framework so that we can capture all of our work. And as part of these, we've developed a series of measures that we can use for both staff and for children and young people across projects, so that we can look at comparing some of our data. And then this slide is just to kind of put that in a little bit more of a kind of realistic perspective. So here I'm just sharing with you a few slides on a project that we've been involved with Sandwell, local authority in the Midlands. And they have significant numbers of children with SLCN in their early years. And they've run a project which is actually ongoing, looking at combining the use of GL's Welcome tool with ICANN's Early Talk Boost. And they found a significant uplift in children's early language skills as a result. So in this next section, I was going to be joined by my colleague from Knowsley, who gives her apologies today. She's moving house, and you'll sympathise, I hope, with how challenging that's going to be in the current circumstances. So I'm just going to run through her slides for you. This is the estimated picture based on research from research statistics that are provided on the Berco 10 Years On website and from Knowsley's own data, just to illustrate the scale of the challenge for this borough. Well, Knowsley's been looking at SLCN as an issue for a number of years now and has undertaken a number of different projects with ICANN to look at addressing this. More recently, we've worked together on these initiatives that are listed here. Knowsley's been part of ICANN's place-based approach, and our role's been to act as a catalyst within that place-based approach to raise awareness and responses to the number of children and young people with SLCN across the borough. And this has led to the number of projects that are shown here. We've got more detail in this pathway slide here. This is one of the pieces of work that we've done with schools to develop a strategic and differentiated approach across primary and secondary schools. We've just expanded that a little bit here. So at this level, there's quite a lot of detail, lots of different initiatives going on, well, lots of different approaches to quality first teaching. And here we have quite a few initiatives going on. As we move forward, there's more work to be done here. and more work to be done here. I wanted to share this initiative with you particularly. So there's a number of initiatives on this page. There is some work we're doing in secondary schools looking at a Year 7 programme and also a Talk for Work programme with the Year 10s. Voice 21 is working in a number of schools across Knowsley to look at the impact of oracy approaches in teaching. And this is the initiative that I really wanted to talk to you about. Prescot Loves to Talk, which is a community initiative, which has been largely brokered by one of the primary schools in Prescot, which is an area within Knowsley local authority. And what they've done is brought together a range of different stakeholders across the town of Prescot. And they've worked together to really try and tackle the fact that talk is not very much valued in their community, that they found that children were starting school with very poor language skills. Families weren't seeing the importance of talk and supporting talk at home, and there wasn't a lot of talk going on in the community. So they've done a number of different, very innovative things to promote talk across their community with all ages. So what's the impact of some of this? Well, we've seen some of the results here. When we started work in Knowsley, schools weren't even really identifying that SLCM was an issue for their children. So despite the kind of statistical information about how many to expect, they actually weren't seeing those children. And particularly, they weren't seeing them in secondary schools. So this final bullet point on the slide here shows actually the increase in identification, which is still below the national average, but is kind of getting up to where we should be in terms of knowing what the issue is. And that's really crucial. So you need to know how many children have SLCN, what that looks like, the impact that that's having on your school, and then you can take some steps to address those challenges and needs. So just finally from Knowsley, these are the future plans. We're building on that increased awareness and recognition that SLCN is a significant challenge for the community in terms of its young people and how much it affects their life chances in ways that we've looked at the beginning of my talk. And we're going to continue to work together to tackle these issues. So finally, I can't really ignore the reason why I'm not standing in front of you today while we're all sitting at home listening to this. So I've just really listed some of the issues that I think are current at the moment, which are really going to impact on children and young people with SLCN. Obviously, some of these have much wider implications, but I think for those of us who are working with this group of families and children, we really need to be thinking about these and how we might address some of these things. So online delivery, we've all moved to online delivery now of education and support for children and young people. We need to look at the evidence base for that, what works. This is a unique opportunity for us to start collecting some of this. So all of those that are doing this at the moment, please give some thought as to how you're going to measure that impact, how you're going to get feedback from families and from children about how that's worked for them. Does it have the same impact as face-to-face? There's some mixed evidence around that at the moment, and this is an opportunity to build on that. For some families, accessing online support is a real issue. So we're working with families who perhaps only have one phone, they don't have laptops, they perhaps don't have Wi-Fi, or they have limited Wi-Fi packages or limited data packages. You can't download a PDF on a phone and look at it. So sometimes following up links for support can be a bit overwhelming for families, and actually accessing things is a real challenge. So we need to think about how we're supporting some families who may be quite isolated, who may not have a lot of language and a lot of talk going on at home. So if there was little talk going on in some families before this, I think that gap will only have widened now. I think the impact on emotional well-being and social skills development of a lot of children is going to be affected by the current isolation and lockdown. And that's something which speech, language and communication skills can both support in terms of helping children to talk through and to think about their emotional well-being, their resilience, and to share some of their anxieties. But those children and young people who have poor language and communication skills, again, we're going to need to think very nimbly about how we support those children in terms of their emotional well-being and their resilience. We're also going to have to think about the wider impact on social communication skills of families being quite isolated, spending time with just parents or parents and siblings, and not having that wider opportunity to develop those really crucial social communication skills. And that goes across age as well. So this isn't just with young children or preschool children, but actually developing increasingly sophisticated ways of communicating with our peer group is an absolutely vital skill that we really need to think about how we're going to support children and young people to develop those as we come out of lockdown and we look at the transition back into the education system. And again, I think we're going to need to come together to really support schools and settings to think about how we support these children and young people to come back into the world of education, to mix again with each other, to look at how we're going to support those children who struggle with speech, language and communication, how we're going to help to structure that transition and support it, and how we're going to support schools to look at those issues that are not just about catching up with the lost learning, but catching up with that lost experience of being education, and how very important and crucial that is. Okay, so I'm conscious that I've gone through this very quickly because I realised that we were under a time constraint. So we've probably kind of reached the end, and we have plenty of time for questions now. So Darren, I'm going to hand back to you to have a look at some of the questions, and we have got time now to have a bit of discussion as well.
Thanks. Thank you, Louisa. Yeah, and there's been some good questions coming in throughout your session. So if we just start with the first one here, you talked earlier about what is typical. Are there specific milestones we should expect students to reach by specific years? And how do we measure what is typical?
Yes, there are. There is a lot of research about how speech, language and communication typically develops. You can find some of that information on ICANN's website. We have some ages and stages, and there are a number of different pointers to look at different ages. But children and young people's language and communication continues to develop. It's not all done and dusted by the time they start school and reception. It's continuing to develop throughout secondary school and actually into further education as well.
Okay, another question here. In the ALST project described, did the health visitors use Welcome?
This is the project in Knowsley. Yes, the health visitors are looking at using Welcome in order to support their identification of children in the early years. So the Welcome has a series of age-related measures which allow you to use a kind of standard approach to measuring children's language. It's also used in a number of children's early years settings across Knowsley, and they find it very useful in allowing them to get past this barrier of everybody's eye going out slightly. So if you work with lots of children who have very low language levels, your view of what is typical can often get skewed. And using something like Welcome will help you to kind of get your eye back in, because it helps you to know what children should be doing at that age.
And we've got a primary school who are using Welcome at the moment, and they say it's working well. They're asking, is it important to have a trained ICANN member of staff in the school too?
I think one of the things that we looked at with Sandwell was combining and this was in early years, was combining the ability that Wellcome has to identify the children and where they are with their speech and language, and that it has a RAG rating so that you can show which children really are, red and so needing a lot of support. It does have some resources and some information and ideas for what you can do to address those children who are amber and red. But what Sandwell found was having the more structured approach of the early talk boost intervention was really helpful. So as a primary school, I mean, obviously it's not essential to have an ICANN trained member of staff, but you might want to have a look at additional interventions that are available if you're finding you've got a lot of red and amber children and you're wanting to have something which the school can deliver to support those children.
Okay, thank you. We've got a school here, they've got 97% EAL pupils, and they're asking how would they identify the initial SLCN need when they do not speak English?
Yeah, that's really tough, isn't it? Wellcome looks at English. It's based on the developmental norms for English speaking children. Clearly, if you have children who are starting school and they're speaking another language and not English, then ideally we'd be saying that you need to look at what their language levels are like in their language at home, because there is a clear difference between SLCN and English as an additional language. So lots of children speak and have really good language levels in their home language. And the challenge is acquiring English, and quite often acquiring English at pace is an expectation in our schools. So we need to look at picking up those children who are struggling in their home language as well as with learning English, and to differentiate between those and children who just haven't been exposed to English but will learn it with the right exposure.
Okay. We've got lots of questions coming in, which is great. The next one, do the SLCN figures ever include pupils with ASD? This person's wondering if the numbers would actually be higher if ASD pupils were included.
Yeah, so the 10% that I mentioned includes children who have speech, language and communication as part of a wider need, broader need. So that would include ASD figures.
Okay. Thank you. So I'm just reading through all the list of questions here to find. In the Sandwell project, sorry about this, Louisa. My screen is just jittering around as more questions come in. In the Sandwell project, how did you decide from the Wellcome scores which children to put into the talk boost groups?
They use the red and amber children in the early talk boost groups.
Okay. How can you identify speech and language needs on online education?
That's really challenging, isn't it? That there's quite a bit of evidence now about teletherapy being working very well for children once their needs have been assessed and identified. We know now, because we're having to do it, that there are a number of speech and language therapy assessments going on online, and I think the specialist teaching support are also doing some online virtual identification of need. I think this is something where we're going to need to work much more closely with parents. There is quite a bit of evidence that parents are able, when they're supported, to identify children's communication needs. So I think needing to look at what tools are available that we can support parents to use to help us to do those assessments.
Okay. What do you believe the best intervention for secondary schools is?
I think there's no one answer to that. It depends on the need. At ICANN, we're trialling an intervention which we know has been very successful at Key Stage 2. In Key Stage 3, and that's looking at catching up children and young people who are starting in year 7 behind where they should be. We've had some preliminary data that that's quite effective. There are some vocabulary interventions that are evidence that work well in secondary schools. And ICANN's also doing a Taught for Work intervention, which is looking at young people identifying their communication needs so that they can then present those to prospective employers. I think the challenge within secondary school is actually fitting an intervention into the daily life of the school. And in some ways, it's more about perhaps working with secondary colleagues to identify ways in which they can use simple strategies to support learners in the classroom.
Mm-hmm. We've got another one here. Our nursery children are also assessed in their home language on entry to class, either by bilingual school staff or by LA approved translators. It is such an insight into a child's language development that you would otherwise not know.
I think that's fantastic. I wish all schools had access to the same resources. I think it's really important that we acknowledge home languages and that we understand how important they are to children and families, not just from a language point of view, but it's really important that we get across the message to families that continuing to develop their home language is really, really important, and that will support children to learn English. We know that children learn English on the foundations of very strong home language skills. So acknowledging those home languages and being able to look at how the children are doing with those as well as with English learning, yeah, that's fantastic.
How can we identify those children who got impacted by COVID-19 on their communication skills?
Well, I think there are probably going to be a lot of them, aren't there? I think one of the issues that those of us who work to support this population of children are going to need to be quite nimble with is how we actually raise awareness of the impact that's likely to have been had on children's language and communication, particularly in those areas of disadvantage which were already struggling with this. And work with early years settings and with schools to give some space to these children so that we can identify and support their language and communication.
We've got a question regarding parents here. How do you manage parents who deny the existence of the issue after presenting to them?
I think it's very difficult for parents. I think it's difficult for parents to hear that there might be a problem with their child. I think that some parents with a first child who have no kind of comparison are perhaps not in a place where they can see that there is an issue. I would always advise working alongside parents, kind of taking them on that journey. We do have online tools that parents can be directed to where they can actually look at what children would be doing typically at their child's age. We've got some progression tools where you can answer a number of questions about what your child would be doing at different ages. And sometimes that can help parents to kind of discover for themselves that there is an issue.
Okay. Thank you. Is there perhaps a parent checklist you would recommend for EAL pupils when trying to identify if there is an SLCM need?
I don't think there's a specific checklist for EAL parents, but I think there are certain questions that you would ask, because obviously the languages are different. Each language is different. I think you need to be very aware that each language develops in different areas at different stages. So you can't just translate an assessment or a measure that you would use from English into another language. Because actually the developmental, what's typical at different ages in another language may not be the same. And clearly that's the case for phonics particularly. So we need to be aware that there are some speech sounds in English which don't exist in some other languages, and that's going to have an impact on children in terms of acquiring phonics. In terms of measures, there are a few online measures. I'm just thinking whether it's, there's a baby lab, which I think is in Plymouth, and that has a questionnaire for parents in terms of kind of percentage exposure to home languages. And that's quite a useful way of getting parents to think about how much of their home language they're using and how much or whether they're using English at all.
We've got one here. Could you suggest one or two simple strategies that all teachers could use in their teaching to support pupils with a language disadvantage?
Yes, I do. I was hoping to fit in a slide on that actually. I think pausing is a really useful strategy. I think you can do that whatever age children or young people you're working with. So pausing, allowing time for reflection, maybe asking a question and letting people think about it, and then saying, I'm going to come back to you and ask you to answer that, is really useful. Visual support is key. I think using a number of different visual reminders of learning, again, that goes across age and phase, is really useful. The problem with language, of course, is the auditory signals here and gone in milliseconds. And so for children who are struggling to process and remember information, visual support's very useful. And finally, I think that considering about how you ask questions is also really useful. So how you structure questions, the length of the questions, the complexity, is all something that all teaching staff can reflect on.
Lovely. I think we've got time for one more. Thank you for everyone's questions. We've had lots and lots, which is brilliant, and I hope it's helped everyone. The last one is, how can we support vocab development? We've had quite a few questions about vocabulary. This one is in secondary, in light of the challenging vocab students come across in GCSEs.
Yeah, I mean, we could have a whole one of these on vocabulary development, couldn't we? It's absolutely crucial, and it is something which is a significant difficulty for children in areas of disadvantage who just haven't come across the depth and breadth of vocabulary exposure that other children have, and where children are struggling with their oral language skills, and that's impacting on their reading. And then that's a double whammy, isn't it? Because actually we develop our increasingly sophisticated vocabulary on the back of reading once we've reached a certain point in terms of our spoken vocabulary. So vocabulary, I think one of the main things perhaps to focus on is what we look at as tier 2 vocabulary. So that those are common words that are used across all the subject areas in a school. Sometimes it's helpful to look at exam language in that context. So looking at words like examine, summarize, presenting different information in different ways supports children to learn vocabulary, but also just check, don't assume that children and young people know these words. You need to check them, and where they don't know them, you need to teach them.
Sorry, Louise, I'm going to ask one more because it's probably quite an important question, is around funding. It can be a challenge for a lot of schools. Are there any funding streams schools could access to help train staff and support students with SLCM?
That's difficult. I mean, there are a number of charities that do support kind of school-based projects. So Shine is one of them. The Laurel Trust is another one. Quite a lot of schools are able to prioritise using pupil premium funding to support SLCN, but it's a really challenging time, isn't it? And it's not going to get any easier in terms of funding, certainly in the short term. I think sometimes it is about the whole school and governors, importantly, looking at what the priorities are in the school for children and young people, and really focusing their resources and time and effort and funding on those very clear priorities.
Great, thank you, Louisa. You've answered a lot of questions there, and obviously you didn't get to see them beforehand, so thank you very much for all your input there. Thank you so much, Louisa, for today. Your insight's been, I'm sure, valuable to everyone that's been listening today. We hope that you found it informative and you got some key takeaways. For anyone who wants to know more about Wellcome, the link's on the screen now to get to our website, and you can download further information around Wellcome, not just for early years, but for primary as well. We have recorded the session today, so there will be an email going around for everyone with the link to that, probably sometime early next week. And I'd just like to thank everyone for attending today. We have some more sessions coming up later on in the month. 20th of May is the next one, where we'll have Right to Succeed talking about place-based change, and also Bolton Local Authority talking about closing the gap. We look forward to seeing you on our future webinars, and thank you very much.